He died without leaving a complete map. November 2024. An elderly man in his 80s dies in a hospital in Malaysia. Within days, investigators, journalists, and financial authorities across multiple countries confront the same unsettling reality. Large portions of his wealth may never be fully accounted for, not because the assets vanished overnight, but because they were embedded in offshore structures so complex that even experienced forensic accountants describe them as extraordinarily difficult to untangle. Dozens of entities spread across multiple jurisdictions, layers of ownership stacked on top of each other, trusts, holding companies, and intercompany loans that blur the line between control and ownership. And the man at the center of it all is no longer alive to explain how it worked. His name was Daim Zainuddin, a former Malaysian finance minister. A powerful figure in the country's economic history. What makes this case unusual is not just the scale of the assets involved, but the contrast between the man and what investigators later uncovered. By most public accounts, Daim lived modestly. Simple clothing, no visible luxury, no yachts, no extravagant residences splashed across social media. To many observers, he appeared almost invisible, a low-profile figure who blended easily into the background. That image would later become central to how investigators and journalists tried to understand what happened. Because while public attention often focuses on corruption that looks obvious, luxury cars, mansions, and excess, this case appeared to follow a different pattern, one rooted not in flashy spending, but in systems. To understand why Daim became such a pivotal figure, you have to go back to Malaysia in the 1980s and 1990s. At the time, the country was undergoing rapid economic growth. Massive infrastructure projects, foreign investment, financial liberalization. And at the center of many of these decisions was Daim Zainuddin, who served as finance minister beginning in 1984. In that role, he had influence over public spending, government-linked companies, bailouts, and financial policy. He didn't just oversee money flows, he helped design the rules governing them. That distinction matters, because corruption, in its simplest form, is easy to recognize. Direct bribes, embezzlement, money quietly transferred to a personal account. But more sophisticated financial misconduct doesn't always look like theft. It can look like policy, like restructuring, like complex, but technically legal, financial engineering. According to investigators and reporting linked to the Pandora Papers, Daim was connected to an extensive offshore network. Shell companies, legal entities that often exist only on paper, were registered in jurisdictions known for financial secrecy: the British Virgin Islands, Jersey, Delaware, Luxembourg, Singapore, among others. Shell companies themselves are not illegal. Multinational corporations use them routinely for tax planning, asset management, and cross-border investment. What drew scrutiny was the scale and layering. Company owned by another company, which was owned by a trust, which was administered by a law firm specializing in confidentiality, each layer adding distance between the asset and its ultimate beneficiary. In technical terms, this kind of structure creates opacity. Even when records exist, tracing control becomes slow, expensive, and sometimes inconclusive. Some investigators compared it to obfuscated code. The information is technically there, but intentionally difficult to read. The real test of this system came during the Asian financial crisis of 1997. Markets collapsed, currencies plunged. Companies that had appeared stable weeks earlier were suddenly facing insolvency. Governments across the region intervened to stabilize their economies. Malaysia was no exception. During this period, state-backed loans, bailouts, and restructuring efforts were deployed to prevent broader economic collapse. Decisions about which companies received assistance were made at the highest levels. Years later, investigators would examine whether some of the companies that benefited from these interventions were linked, directly or indirectly, to offshore entities connected to Daim. The allegation was not that every bailout was corrupt. Many were widely seen as necessary at the time. The question raised by investigators was whether some interventions also had the effect of protecting or enriching private interests connected to complex offshore holdings. In several cases, companies that received public support later returned to profitability. Profits flowed to shareholders, some of which were offshore entities. Those offshore entities, in turn, were connected through multiple layers to trusts and companies named in the Pandora Papers. The transactions themselves were often documented and, on paper, lawful. Loans between related entities, investments routed through holding companies, dividends paid across borders. Individually, each transaction could appear legitimate. Collectively, they formed a structure that investigators argue concentrated enormous value outside direct public oversight. The full scale remains uncertain. Public reporting linked to the Pandora Papers identified at least 71 undeclared assets connected to Daim, including companies, trusts, and high-value properties. Conservative estimates place their value in the hundreds of millions of dollars, with some analysts suggesting the true figure could be significantly higher. One of the most prominent assets was Ilham Tower, a 60-story office building in Kuala Lumpur. Investigators traced its ownership through multiple offshore entities before concluding it was ultimately linked to Daim. In 2021, the release of the Pandora Papers marked a turning point. Nearly 12 million leaked documents from offshore service providers gave journalists and authorities new visibility into financial structures that had been deliberately designed to remain private. For the first time, investigators could connect pieces of a network that had previously appeared disconnected. Malaysia's Anti-Corruption Commission opened a formal investigation. Forensic accountants began reconstructing ownership chains. According to officials involved, the complexity was extreme, with circular loans, dormant companies, and trusts whose beneficiaries were obscured by legal protections. In 2024, formal charges were filed, including failure to declare assets. Daim was ordered to appear in court. His legal team argued that his health made participation impossible. On November 13, 2024, Daim Zainuddin died. With his death, investigators lost the only person who fully understood how every part of the system fit together. Unlike legitimate wealth management structures, which typically include succession plans and clear documentation, many of the offshore arrangements under investigation appear to lack transparent pathways for asset recovery or inheritance. His family has stated that they were unaware of many of the offshore assets. Authorities have not publicly confirmed whether this is true or false. What is clear is that without complete records, authorization documents, and cooperation from intermediaries across multiple jurisdictions, recovering the assets is exceptionally difficult. Governments have frozen and seized what they can prove. Properties within Malaysia, accounts with clear ownership trails, but large portions of the network remain out of reach. Some offshore entities may eventually be dissolved due to inactivity. Assets may be liquidated and distributed according to whatever legal documentation exists, often benefiting trustees, intermediaries, or secondary beneficiaries shielded by confidentiality laws. The money doesn't vanish. It simply disappears into the system. Daim's legacy in Malaysia is complicated. Some of the policies and projects he supported contributed to long-term economic development. Others are now viewed through a more critical lens, with questions about where public interest ended and private benefit began. The investigation continues. New assets occasionally surface. New connections are made, but authorities acknowledge they may never see the full picture. This case highlights an uncomfortable reality about the global financial system. Tax havens exist because powerful economies allow them to exist. Corporate secrecy laws are legal by design. Offshore banking operates within frameworks created by governments themselves. Daim did not need to break the system to benefit from it. He understood it. And that may be the most unsettling part of this story. Because the most sophisticated corruption doesn't always look like a crime. Sometimes it looks like policy, like accounting, like paperwork. The quiet figures rarely attract attention. And by the time anyone starts asking questions, the architect is already gone. If this story changed how you think about money, power, and systems, subscribe. Because this isn't an isolated case. It's a pattern. Next episode. A cryptocurrency exchange that reported a catastrophic loss. Investigators later questioned whether the loss ever happened at all. Until then, remember, the people who control the system don't always need to break the rules. Sometimes, they just understand them better than everyone else.